What if one of the most elite military units in the world, tasked with protecting national security, was secretly entangled in drug trafficking, corruption, and even murder? Imagine a place where illicit deals happen underground, trust is betrayed by those sworn to protect, and death is sometimes the price for silence. Welcome to Fort Bragg, the home of Delta Force and other top special forces units, where the line between heroism and criminality blurs. Today, we dive into the Fort Bragg Cartel, Seth Harp's explosive and eye-opening investigation that uncovers a dangerous criminal network operating inside the U.S. military itself, revealing drug cartels, cover-ups, and violence right where we least expect it. Why pick up the Fort Bragg Cartel? Because this isn't just another military exposé or war story. It's a gripping true crime investigation that sheds light on a dark side of America's military wars, one that often stays hidden from public scrutiny. This book is essential for anyone who wants to understand the unintended domestic consequences of America's endless wars abroad. It reveals how the global drug trade complicates military missions and how some of the very soldiers fighting these wars have become part of the problem. If you care about justice, military accountability, or want to understand the real impact of the forever wars, this book offers an unvarnished truth that's both shocking and necessary. About the author. Seth Harp is a veteran journalist and former U.S. Army Reserve soldier who served a tour in Iraq during the same time frame as some key figures. In his book, his unique background gives him deep insight into the military culture and the conflicts he investigates. Harp's military experience fuels his commitment to uncovering uncomfortable truths from inside the armed forces. His personal connection to combat veterans enables him to tell these stories with empathy and authenticity. Harp has emerged as a powerful voice shedding light on issues ranging from corruption within elite military units to the long-term fallout of U.S. foreign wars. About the book. The Fort Bragg Cartel, Drug Trafficking and Murder in Special Forces dives into a shocking true story from one of the world's most secretive military bases. The book begins with an investigation into the murders of two Special Forces soldiers at Fort Bragg, Delta Force operator Billy Levine and support officer Timothy DeMar. From there, Harp unravels a web of drug trafficking, involving coke and heroin, linked to the Los Zetas cartel in Mexico, an organization with its own dark history tied directly to U.S.-trained Mexican military units. The narrative blends true crime, military history, and geopolitical analysis, exposing corruption, substance abuse, and unchecked violence within the U.S. military's premier fighting force. Let's dive deep into the chapter-wise summary. Chapter 1. The murders that hit a cartel. In December 2020, the discovery of two murdered soldiers rocked Fort Bragg, the home of the U.S. Army's elite Special Operations Forces. Billy Levine, a highly skilled Delta Force operator, and Timothy DeMar, a support officer with Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, were found shot in an isolated training area. Initial reports called it a tragic double homicide, yet the circumstances quickly indicated something far more sinister and far-reaching. Billy Levine had an exemplary military record, but rumors swirled about his connections to drug trafficking within the military's ranks. This was not the isolated incident it appeared to be. Rather, the murders unlocked investigations that revealed deep-rooted corruption and a cartel operating underneath the heralded image of Fort Bragg. Seth Harp's investigative journey began with this startling event, pushing beyond official narratives. Harp paints a vivid picture of the initial confusion and disbelief within the base community. The story introduces a cast of soldiers, some heroic, others tainted by involvement in narcotics. The tension between loyalty to comrades and the pursuit of truth marks the core of this mystery. This chapter lays the groundwork for understanding how murders within a sacred military stronghold could signal the existence of illicit cartels thriving in the shadows. Harp quotes investigators and insiders, describing Levine's dual worlds. On one hand, a decorated operator. On the other, a man deeply enmeshed in covert drug trafficking. Beyond just the murders, this chapter highlights the opaque nature of military investigations when sovereign interests and classified operations collide with criminal enterprises. Law enforcement faced challenges, missing evidence, reluctant witnesses, and pressure to protect the Army's reputation. Harp writes, The murders of Lavigne and Dumas were more than a crime story. They were a window into a dark system that America's military elites worked hard to conceal. He vividly recounts interviews with soldiers who feared retaliation, describing how cartel activity was an open secret to some, but those who spoke out were either ignored or silenced. The chapter provides detailed accounts of the physical location where the bodies were found, emphasizing the remoteness and secrecy surrounding the crime scene. The readers understand the stakes. This was not just about drug deals but protecting a covert infrastructure embedded deep within military ranks. Harp sets a tone of urgent investigation, signaling to readers that the murders were only the visible tip of a sprawling criminal network. The foundational question emerges: how does such a cartel survive and operate within a place as disciplined as Fort Bragg? Chapter 2. How corruption took root. This chapter delves into the systemic factors that allowed corruption and illicit drug trafficking to take hold within one of the military's most revered institutions. It details how an environment supposedly built on honor and discipline can gradually become fertile ground for criminal enterprises under certain conditions. Harp paints a comprehensive picture of the culture within Fort Bragg, emphasizing how secrecy and loyalty, values necessary for operational security, can become a double-edged sword. Soldiers adhere to a warrior code, where speaking out against peers is taboo. This code, combined with the isolation of military life, nurtures a dangerous silence. The chapter investigates the role substance abuse played, noting how some soldiers suffering from PTSD and mental health struggles turned to drugs. This created vulnerabilities which the cartel exploited for recruitment and enforcement. There is an exploration of drug availability on base, the normalization of illicit activities, and a lack of meaningful oversight. Harp identifies the absence of accountability as a major factor allowing the cartel to thrive. Chain of command oversight was described as sporadic or complicit. He cites anonymous interviews with military personnel who reveal the existence of protected operators involved in trafficking, shielded by senior officers or special permissions. The author also discusses the complicity of some in the civilian sectors that support military operations, such as logistics contractors and civilian employees, adding layers to the secret economy of the cartel. Throughout this chapter, Harp uses specific examples to illustrate how corruption seeped in. One striking case involves a supply sergeant whose job ostensibly was to handle mundane tasks but who became a key figure in smuggling operations. The chapter underscores the role of fear in preserving the cartel's secrecy. Soldiers who tried to leave or resist were met with intimidation or threats, creating a coercive atmosphere. The author reflects on how such a toxic environment puts even the most principled soldiers in impossible situations, blending complicity with survival. In addition, this chapter reveals how social media and informal communications sometimes betrayed cartel members, but military authorities were slow or reluctant to act decisively. Harp writes, corruption at Fort Bragg was not just about a few bad apples. It was entwined in the military's systemic failures, a disease masked by uniforms and medals. This chapter is pivotal as it shifts the narrative from a simple crime investigation into a broad expose of military culture vulnerabilities and institutional blind spots that allowed drug trafficking networks to flourish under the nose of command. Chapter 3. The military's link to Los Zetas. In this chapter, Seth Harp reveals one of the most startling aspects of the Fort Bragg cartel story: the connection between U.S. Special Forces and the notorious Mexican cartel Los Zetas. Originally formed as an elite unit within Mexico's military, Los Zetas soldiers had undergone specialized training by U.S. Special Operations Forces, including those stationed at Fort Bragg. This military-to-military cooperation was designed to strengthen regional security but had unintended consequences. Harp explains how Los Zetas later broke away, transforming from a government force into one of Mexico's most brutal and violent drug cartels, involved in trafficking cocaine, heroin, and other substances into the United States. The irony and tragedy of this history weigh heavily throughout the chapter. The narrative traces how cartel members, many with military training and tactics, used their elite skills for criminal pursuits. Harp details how Los Zetas established a powerful presence trafficking drugs and controlling smuggling corridors that connect directly to U.S. military installations. Behind this dark evolution lies a complex relationship of complicity, tacit approval, and sometimes active involvement from elements within the U.S. military and intelligence apparatus. Harp cites interviews and classified documents, illustrating how soldiers and civilian contractors at Fort Bragg became entangled with this transnational cartel network, either knowingly or through coercion. One revealing episode recounts how cartel operatives used military-style tactics within the U.S., including intimidation, assassinations, and trafficking routes disguised as military logistics operations. This eroded the boundary between lawful military activity and criminal enterprise. Furthermore, Harp exposes how the cartel used this base connection to expand their operations stateside, exploiting the trust, logistics, and resources available through military channels. Soldiers returning from tours in Afghanistan and Iraq sometimes became unwitting carriers or facilitators in the trafficking pipeline. The consequence is a deeply embedded cartel presence that mimics military precision and organizational discipline, making it difficult to dismantle. The chapter also explores the challenges investigators face in uncovering such activities while respecting operational secrecy and protecting national security interests. Throughout this chapter, Harp highlights quotes from both former soldiers and law enforcement officials who expressed dismay at the blurred lines between U.S. military efforts and criminal cartels they once aimed to dismantle. In closing, the chapter serves as a cautionary tale about the unintended blowback of foreign military partnerships. It questions how much the Fort Bragg cartel's roots lie in the military's own efforts to train foreign forces, and the consequences when those forces turn rogue. This dynamic lays bare how complex and shadowy the battle lines between war, crime, and national security can become. Chapter 4. The surge in mysterious deaths. Between 2020 and 2021, an unprecedented number of deaths occurred at or near Fort Bragg. Harp records 109 fatalities involving soldiers, with only a fraction related to overseas combat. This startling statistic forces a harsh look at the conditions stateside and the impact of the cartel's pervasive influence. The chapter reports that many of these deaths were ruled as suicides, accidental overdoses, or unexplained incidents, but the scale and circumstances raised serious questions suggesting darker causes. Some soldiers appeared caught between cartel violence, substance abuse, and ongoing operational stress. Harp weaves individual stories to illustrate the tragic human toll, describing soldiers who fell victim to drug overdoses, violent crimes, and suspicious circumstances unexplained by official investigations. Particular attention is paid to soldiers linked to anti-cartel whistleblowing or suspected trafficking activities. The chapter investigates the mental health crisis exacerbated by decades of continuous deployments in foreign wars, poor veteran care, and access to addictive substances. Drug addiction became both a symptom and an enabler of cartel activities within the military community. Additionally, Harp exposes how cartel-related intimidation and violence likely played a significant role in these deaths, using assassinations to silence opposition and maintain control. The narrative recounts accounts from insiders who feared for their safety yet felt trapped by institutional apathy. The juxtaposition of Fort Bragg as a place of elite military training and a locus of mysterious deaths underscores an alarming contradiction. Soldiers trained to fight abroad face deadly dangers closer to home, dangers not just from enemies overseas but from illicit networks within. Further complicating efforts to investigate these deaths was a military culture that shrouds internal problems in secrecy to protect the institution's image. Families and advocates often struggle to gain clarity or justice. Harp concludes the chapter by emphasizing the need to address this cascade of tragedies honestly, recognizing that the deaths were a multifaceted crisis involving mental health, drug abuse, and criminal violence interlinked by cartel influence. Chapter 5. Whistleblowers and the Walls of Silence. In this chapter, Seth Harp shines a spotlight on the brave soldiers and personnel who risked everything to expose the Fort Bragg cartel. Despite the dangers, a number of insiders came forward to reveal the cartel's operations, drug trafficking routes, and the internal culture that protected it. Their stories unveil both courage and the overwhelming resistance they faced. Harp reveals how whistleblowers were met with hostility, threats, and sometimes physical violence. The military's culture of loyalty and silence, often necessary for unit cohesiveness, became a barrier to truth. Speaking out was seen as betrayal, with whistleblowers labeled as troublemakers or worse, targets for retaliation. Some were forced out, demoted, or suffered harm in attempts to suppress their voices. The chapter includes first-hand accounts of individuals who detailed covert drug handoffs on base, protected operatives involved in trafficking, and attempts to shut down investigations. These testimonies underscore the complexity of confronting entrenched corruption inside a tightly controlled environment. Harp emphasizes the systemic failures that enabled this environment, noting how senior officers often ignored or dismissed reports to avoid scandal. Investigations stalled, witnesses were intimidated, and evidence was sometimes manipulated or withheld. The chilling consequences of silence are made clear. Drug trafficking persisted, violence escalated, and soldiers suffered. Harp quotes a former soldier who said, "You either stay quiet or you disappear. There's no middle ground." The chapter also highlights efforts by reform-minded advocates within and outside the military pushing for protections to empower whistleblowers. Yet, the path remains fraught as institutional inertia fights against exposure. Through this harrowing chapter, readers gain insight into the human cost of institutional cover-ups and the personal sacrifices made by those who dare to stand against criminal networks operating inside America's most elite forces. Chapter 6. Inside Delta Force and JSOC. This chapter provides a rare and eye-opening look inside the highly secretive world of Delta Force and Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. These units operate in the shadows of military operations, tasked with the most dangerous and classified missions. Harp draws on interviews with former operators and official military sources to illustrate the elite training, stealth tactics, and close-knit culture of these forces. However, he also reveals the logistical and ethical challenges faced when elements within these units became entangled in illicit activities. The revelation that some operators traffic drugs abroad and within U.S. bases adds complexity to the narrative. For soldiers accustomed to covert operations and operating with autonomy, the lines between mission and illicit enterprise could blur, sometimes under the radar of oversight. Harp explores how the stress of repeated deployments, exposure to combat trauma, and a culture valuing toughness may have contributed to substance abuse and poor decision-making, creating vulnerabilities exploited by the cartel network. The chapter details high-level operational secrecy that complicated investigations. Intelligence gaps, classified status, and interagency rivalries slowed down efforts to dismantle trafficking routes linked to military personnel. Harp accentuates the paradox. While Delta Force operators executed precision missions against international terrorists, some were simultaneously involved in drug trafficking that financed violence they ostensibly fought against. The detailed portraits of operators caught between professional duty and criminal involvement reveal a fractured moral landscape and raise urgent questions about oversight in these elite forces. Chapter 7. Mexico's Delta Force and the Los Zetas connection. This chapter traces the origins of one of the world's most ruthless cartels, Los Zetas, and its deep connections to U.S. military training programs. Originally formed by Mexican special forces, trained and equipped by the U.S. Army, Los Zetas evolved from a paramilitary group into a brutal criminal organization trafficking drugs across North America. Harp recounts how the U.S. military's intention to build capable allied forces ironically birthed a cartel that would come to rival the violence and scope of the drug cartels it aimed to defeat. Detailing interviews and declassified documents, Harp illustrates the shocking transition of trained soldiers into merciless traffickers and assassins. He explains how lessons in tactics, organization, and intelligence gathering lent Los Zetas a military discipline rare among criminal groups. The cartel's infiltration of U.S. military bases and supply routes forms a central thread linking the international drug trade to domestic military corruption. This legacy leaves a frayed geopolitical fabric where allies and enemies blur. Harp shares chilling anecdotal evidence of cartel violence spilling into U.S. cities and military communities, and how cartel operatives used military-grade weapons and strategies with devastating efficiency by contextualizing Los Zetas' origins within U.S. foreign policy frameworks. The chapter shines light on unintended blowback. How America's military strategies abroad can create dangerous domestic threats. Chapter 8. The domestic fallout of America's wars. In this chapter, Seth Harp explores the profound domestic consequences of America's forever wars abroad, focusing on how continuous military engagement overseas has fueled the rise of criminal networks and drug cartels that directly impact soldiers and communities back home. Harp argues that the endless cycle of deployments, combat stress, and the vast global footprint of the U.S. military have created both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Exploited by drug trafficking networks. These networks, operating through bases like Fort Bragg, entangle soldiers in illicit dealings, often without their full awareness of the broader corruption at play. Drawing on case studies and testimonies, Harp reveals how soldiers returning from deployment sometimes become involved in drug use or trafficking, creating a cyclical dynamic of addiction and crime within military ranks. The lack of sufficient mental health support exacerbates this issue, leaving many veterans vulnerable to cartel influence. The chapter also discusses how the military's mission creep and clandestine operations in unstable regions often blur the lines between combat and criminal enterprise. Soldiers training Allied forces abroad, as seen with Los Zetas in Mexico, inadvertently train fighters who later morph into traffickers and cartel members. Harp highlights the blowback effect, where the consequences of foreign military policy reverberate at home, bringing violence, drugs, and corruption into the U.S. This perspective challenges common perceptions that the battle against narcotics is confined geographically overseas. The author critiques the lack of strategic planning for the long-term domestic fallout of continuous wars, underscoring that the war's costs extend beyond battlefield statistics and military budgets. They exact human and social tolls within the soldier community. Harp quotes a veteran who stated, "The war didn't end when we came home. It came with us." This sentiment captures the emotional and social complexities soldiers face and the systemic failures to address them. Finally, the chapter calls for integrated approaches that link military, public health, and law enforcement efforts to confront this multifaceted crisis. Recognizing the cartel's influence is essential to protecting soldiers and restoring integrity within the military system. Chapter 9. Federal investigations and indictments. This chapter details recent federal government efforts to break the Fort Bragg Cartel's grip on the military base and bring justice to those involved in drug trafficking and murders. Following the murders of Billy Levine and Timothy Dumas, the Department of Justice and FBI launched investigations into cartel operations, providing a glimpse of hope in an otherwise shadow-filled saga. Harp chronicles the complex legal battles and investigations that unfolded, including grand jury indictments, arrests of suspected traffickers, and ongoing prosecutions. The chapter highlights how federal authorities had to navigate classified information, military bureaucracy, and active threats from cartel operatives. The investigations revealed the cartel's intricate structure, including connections to military personnel, civilian contractors, and outside criminal organizations. Harp presents court documents and testimonies that exposed how drugs were trafficked using military resources and protected by layers of silence and corruption. Despite these advances, Harp acknowledges the many obstacles still blocking full accountability, including institutional reluctance within the military to fully cooperate, challenges coordinating various agencies, and the cartel's entrenched power. The chapter also explores the tension between national security secrecy and the rights of victims and whistleblowers seeking transparency. Harp emphasizes the balance investigators must strike between protecting classified operations and uncovering criminal activity within those environments. Statements from prosecutors highlight the high stakes. Dismantling the cartel is not only about justice for murdered soldiers but protecting the integrity and safety of American military forces. Harp stresses that these federal efforts, though significant, represent only the beginning of wide-reaching reforms needed to purge corruption from elite forces and prevent future criminal infiltration. Chapter 10. The road ahead, reform and accountability. In the final chapter, Harp turns to the future, laying out recommendations and a call to action. Having exposed how deep corruption and cartel influence run within Fort Bragg's elite ranks, the chapter confronts the urgent question: how do we prevent such criminal enterprises from flourishing again? Harp advocates for comprehensive reforms focusing on transparency, whistleblower protections, mental health support, and command accountability. He argues that ending the culture of silence is the foundational step toward rebuilding trust in the military institution. The chapter discusses specific policies capable of creating change, including independent oversight bodies, enhanced internal reporting mechanisms, and cultural shifts to encourage speaking out without fear of retaliation. Harp also stresses the importance of mental health initiatives, recognizing how untreated trauma and substance abuse create vulnerabilities exploited by cartels. Leadership training is highlighted as critical, promoting ethical conduct and emphasizing accountability at every level, from enlisted personnel to senior officers. The author calls on policymakers, military leaders, and the public to demand institutional change and support investigations without obstruction. He underscores that reforms must be sustained and backed by political will to succeed. Throughout, Harp maintains a sympathetic tone toward soldiers caught in impossible dilemmas and honors those who risk their careers to expose corruption. The chapter closes with a powerful reminder: the fight to reform and cleanse the military of cartel influence is ongoing. While the Fort Bragg Cartel remains a dark chapter, it also represents an opportunity for transformation rooted in courage, transparency, and justice. The Fort Bragg Cartel is a harrowing, must-read exposé that uncovers a deeply disturbing truth about the U.S. military and drug trafficking. Seth Harp's detailed investigation challenges us to rethink what we know about military heroism and highlights the severe cost of America's wars, not only abroad but at home. If you want to understand the profound connections between war, drugs, and corruption, this book is essential. It urges us all to demand transparency, accountability, and justice. If you found this summary interesting, please like, subscribe, and share to help spread awareness. Let us know in the comments what you think about the challenges facing our military and justice system. Thank you for watching.